Rob Bertholf here, and I wanted to do kind of a fun video today. I actually got asked a question recently about, we're having a conversation about dinosaurs. So I thought I'd throw this together real quick. Ultimately, I want to make a logical and biblical argument that dinosaurs never existed, at least not how we picture them. And I'll share how this lie got started. But first, let's really set a foundation. Again, this video is not about disproving evolution or that dinosaurs farted themselves into extinction. It's more about giving a rational answer to why there's, large bones have been discovered. And some may reference the behemoth or Leviathan to argue that there were these monstrous creatures created by God. But a quick Bible study shows that the Leviathan is actually just describing Lucifer, right? And really, you can kind of go through the different quotes, and I put on the screen here if you want to pause and run through these. But ultimately what we find is that, it's talking about how the Leviathan is king over all the children of pride. And we know that Lucifer's downfall is pride. And there's a lot of other references that make it very, very clear that this is not an actual sea beast, sea being the populated areas. Also, if we look into it, the behemoth or Enoch has all the characteristics of Christ, and even has described as the chief of the ways of God. Right? So this clearly isn't referring to an ox, although, Christ is described as having an ox and taking the burden for us. We will read also that, every species that God created was preserved on the ark. And so there were not any dinosaurs, brought onto the ark that were, let's say, created by amalgamation. But also clearing that, amalgamation exists today, meaning the crossbreeding. And so, there was crossbreeding happening, but it wasn't, creating new species the same way you cannot create new species today. It was just perverting existing species. And we also see that they're still doing this today. Dogs and cats are one of the most common amalgamations. But even with that, even with crossbreeding, there's a limit to how large animals can get. And so the question becomes, well, how did the animals get so big? How did we have these bones that are clearly large bones? And I think if we read through, we can find that there used to be much larger men and beasts that live on the earth today. And we can factor in why this happened. So if we read through the various different lengths of the ages found in Genesis, we'll find that man lived almost 1,000 years. But after the flood, the age of man dropped significantly. So again, prior to the flood, men were living like 800 years, and now today it's like maybe 80 maximum, right? So it's fair to say that men used to live 10 times longer than they live today. But more interestingly, also were twice the size. In fact, Adam was 2 times taller than man is now. But remember that this was not based on how long they lived, right? Humans have a determined height. Essentially, they reach a certain height and stop growing. So the answer is with indeterminate growth. This is where animals do not stop growing until they die. Examples of this include sharks, right? Bison, tortoises, lobster, lizards, right? Snakes, kangaroos, sharks, and many of the amphibians which simply keep growing until they die, right? In fact, take the kangaroo. Their skeletons continue to grow throughout the years. So given enough time, they could grow to enormous sizes. So now imagine, we'll take this kangaroo, and remember how we showed that man lived 10 times longer, and even with a determinate growth, he was still 2 times as big. So it would be safe to assume that the living creatures were also initially larger, and the ones that had indeterminate growth, if they're living for 10 times longer, they're going to be quite massive, right? Then we factor in this indeterminate growth. Think how big a kangaroo who lived 10 times as long and already started twice as large, think how big they would be. I mean, absolutely massive, right? So when we look at the kangaroo skeleton, then enlarge it 10 times the size, it's not hard to see why, this was seen as some sort of dinosaur, right? Maybe the T-Rex, right? Look how it's exactly the same structure as the T-Rex, right? So even if it's not the T-Rex, right? Even if the T-Rex wasn't a kangaroo, remember that in the last 100 years, there's been 18 animals that went extinct. So The point is that many of the what we identify as modern day dinosaurs don't have a modern day equivalent. They could be super unique looking animals that were alive back then in the sense of dying off, but the bone structure all looks similar. And what is really different is the interpretation of them. So first off, we have to understand that most dinosaur discoveries are not well preserved. It's like we're not getting these entire fossils. They're getting a few bones here and a few bones there. And yes, they're quite larger than today, but man's logic to think that these are different creatures that are no longer around. And so they take the bones and they try to imagine them in these kind of, fanciful constructions of what these strange creatures must have looked like. Now, where did this come from? Richard Owen was the first to coin the term dinosauria, meaning great fossil lizards, and was also the first, was among those that started to create this narrative of dinosaurs, which fit perfectly into the atheistic view that, before man existed, there were these massive animals. And he was described by his colleagues as malicious, dishonest, and hateful individual who was also sadistic. Right? So just a little context as we explore this idea of dinosaurs, who was the person that coined the term and who was the one that tried to push this idea was a unhappy little man, right? And that kind of, it caught on because it fit a atheist viewpoint. Well, when I was a kid, my parents took me to Dinosaur National Monument, and, where, side by side next to these recreated skeleton, there was this artist rendering of what the skeletons must have looked like with muscles and skin. And I just took this as face value, but I never actually really looked into it more. And I just assumed, okay, there must have been these dinosaurs created and maybe God created them, but I never actually understood it. And it kind of bothered me for a while. And so, when I really looked into it more, what became so interesting is that it was all about the artist rendering, right? So if we were to take a normal skeleton of a baboon, a zebra, an elephant, a swan, if we were to take these and then give them to a dinosaur, illustrator, you would find that they just kind of drape skin over bones and then add fierce features, right? And it's rarely supported by the skeletons. Here's a perfect example. This is a rabbit skeleton, okay? We know what a rabbit looks like. It's fuzzy, it's cute, right? It's got these beautiful ears, it's got a lot of fat on it, right? So we have this cute little rabbit, but if we strip away the fur and the cute ears, here's the skeleton. Now, render that as a dinosaur, right? So yeah, this is the problem with man's interpretation. This is why we have dinosaurs, is because they're not thinking like, could this have been a rabbit? When we also look at a beautiful swan, right? This would have been seen as this strange monster. So a swan that's very large could have seemed to be some sort of crazy sea monster. Look at its has no beautiful wings. It has these kind of creepy little claw things in the front, right? Same thing. There's no way they would have known from a skeletal structure that an elephant has a trunk. And so these are things that if you just kind of put some common sense into play, right, we'll figure out that it's been really an agenda of the atheistic community to try and invent any way they can to explain things without God and to explain things, through their own lens. There's a great video if you want some simple answers by a channel called Answers in Genesis. But ultimately what I'm trying to say is this, right? Just get data, right? Use the data, apply logic, and we should use the brains that God gave us. So ultimately, I was thinking about doing maybe a few videos along this line of not believing everything that we're told. And I think, dinosaurs is a fun way to start this one out.